Thanks so much for the invitation, for the introduction. As was already pointed out, I will talk about Hegel in the Anthropocene, and I'm going to sketch certain thoughts that I have on these issues. Here is just generally the kind of trajectory for today. So I want to start by just say some preliminary things about how in the world could you at all bring Hegel and the Anthropocene together. Why could you think this is somehow appropriate, right? And so this will be my first step. The way I want to approach it, or my general sense of the role he plays, is that he has a double role, and that this double role makes him especially interesting and an important resource. I want to develop this double significance that Hegel has vis-a-vis the Anthropocene as a thinker of the Anthropocene, maybe as someone that is delivering an apology of it or a defense of the self-understanding underlying it. Firstly, so that's section 2. And then section 3, trying to show the extent to which here already is an internal critique of the Anthropocenic mind. All right, so let me just say a certain amount of preliminary things about Hegel in the Anthropocene. Now, I assume that you are all aware of this term, the Anthropocene. It is a term that was introduced by not in philosophy in the first place, but in geography, geology. And it's called the Anthropocene because the anthropos has become a determining factor in that age. So the notion of the Anthropocene suggests that human beings, or the modern life form, has affected the Earth system so thoroughly that it has really shifted the balance of this Earth system and has introduced us into a new geological age. Of course, climate change is a prominent issue in this regard. So we are quite aware that there's human-made climate change now that will haunt us for millennia now. So we have induced cascades of effects that will now really shift the balance. So we are trying to mitigate the situation, not very well, but so this is an ongoing political effort. But it's undeniable that there's something like climate change. We have introduced new substances into the cosmos of the Earth. You all are aware of a certain kind of chemically produced substances that don't have an expiration date, that will stick around forever. We have produced certain kind of nuclear stuff of a certain matter and so on. So we have changed you can already see in the sediments of the Earth that some changes happen, that some new things arise in our age that haven't been there before. And so the suggestion is the human being has revealed itself to be a power that has become a geological force. I mean, all kinds of living beings change their environments, make their environments into their habitat, and the human species is a especially successful one, you might say here, and it also inhabits the whole globe. And so therefore, there's a way in which you could say there's a large impact on the whole environment, but that's not the point. They really want to say, well, it has become a geological force. So the substance of the Earth, you could say, is being modified by our life form. That's the one thought that's prominent in the thinking of the Anthropocene. So human being has become a geological force. And the other, more importantly, even I would suggest, is the suggestion that the way in which we have become a geological force is not due to the intentional transformation that we have induced. So it's not that we intended to change the face of the Earth. And these changes are the most impactful, the most relevant, the ones that introduce us into the Anthropocene. But effects that went along with the things we did intentionally revealed even more impactful. So we introduced a form of life, and in terms of sustaining it, used all kinds of fossil energy, fossil fuels, and wasted them into the atmosphere. And no one intended to change the CO2 level in the atmosphere, but that's what we did, and that has changed the current trajectory of the Earth. So you have the suggestion that the human being is quite powerful and intervenes into nature, and he intervenes by virtue of his intentional and intentional intervention into nature and his attempt to realize and actualize spirit, he thereby intervenes into nature in a way that is more that he does not really oversee, that he has not intended, that is of the sort of a natural effect of something. So it can be described on a causal level more than on a level of purposive action, right? And so it's on this level that our actual power has become manifest, and this kind of power realizes itself in such a manner that it undermines our future existence on this planet and also our future capacity to self-determination. So it undermines the very conditions of possibility of freedom. Yeah. So that's the basic idea of the Anthropocene as I see it, right? And now you could ask, what in the world could Hegel have to do with this, right? So, and I think that there are two things that I wanted to point you to. So I first said there is this interest that the Anthropocene formulates in the notion that the human being has become a geological force. You could say, well, Hegel is very interested in how impactful the human being is, but a geological force. But actually, it's not a thought that's foreign to him at all. And I've brought you a quote from the Aesthetics that I want to read out. I'm going to read it out in English, but you have the German here as well. I'm reading out. The Dutch themselves have made the greatest part of the land on which they dwell and live. It has continually been defended against the storms of the sea, and it has to be maintained. And so this is in a section on the Aesthetics where Hegel talks about the ways in which the Dutch are so famous for their portrayal of nature, which seems to be kind of a mimetic kind of art, which is an inferior form of art for the most part on Hegel's account. And so you could wonder, why are they interested in depicting nature? So what's so interesting, and also in depicting everyday life? And Hegel here tries to say, well, the Dutch are doing this because the nature that you see in these pictures, is a thing they have built themselves, they have produced, right? And he praises them to be sturdy people, to have created the land from the sea. They have just torn it from the sea, the land on which they live, right? And so. So he's quite interested in the human being becoming a geological force. And interestingly, in this case, you could say he's in praise of it. So he thinks it's a true sign of the power of human freedom that we can do such a thing. So that we can create the land on which we live. Yeah. So in that sense, this thought that the human being is a geological force is not foreign to him. Now, you could also say that the thought that human beings prove their power by virtue of the things that they do not intend is a very Hegelian thought, of course. And so therefore, I think that suggesting that the true power of the human being in the transformation of nature might not just show itself in the things that we have intended to do with it, try to give it the form that we want to give it, make it useful for certain purposes that we have, but in the unintended self-producing, self-constitutive effects that it had. So that too is the thought that is not antithetical to Hegel. And just one further element I want to introduce to suggest to you that it's not really far from what Hegel thinks. Hegel has very rarely discussed, but he has a very interesting account of the earth in his philosophy of nature. And so it's the first part of his description of the organic realm of nature. And so in that sense, you could say the earth belongs to the organic, but it has a very kind of shady and interesting position there. It's neither is it a mechanism in the sense that it's not alive. It is alive, you could say, but it's also not an organism. So the whole discourse on Gaia sometimes takes the term that Gaia is supposed to be described as a superorganism or as an organism, or it's sometimes connected in German idealism to the thought that there is a world soul, so that we should understand of the earth, or then maybe even of the universe, as a bodily totality that is inhabited by one soul, and because of this, we are just tiny little pieces within, like microorganisms within the superorganism, and therefore another respect is owed to the earth. And I think that's a very interesting feature of Hegel's account, that he does not go that way, that he does not like the idea of the world soul in this sense, and the idea of the notion that the universe or the earth is an organism in this sense, but rather what the earth has is what the earth is a certain type of anorganic life, right? And so this means it is intimately connected to life. It is constituted out of the remnants of life. On Hegel's account, can only be understood as being produced by millennia of life on Earth, right? So the way the Earth is the production of this, the way in which it has been inhabited. So it's a remnant of life, but it is life in the state of its anorganic aggregate character. And this kind of anorganic aggregate form of life is a condition of possibility of organic life. And so this introduces a kind of notion of the earth that I think is quite interesting and highly productive for the topics that are being discussed vis-a-vis the Anthropocene. So you have here two quotes from the Philosophy of Nature. I don't think I have to read them out, but they kind of flesh out what I just said, this kind of notion that the earth is a form of anorganic life. Now, okay, maybe I've convinced you now that this talk of the Anthropocene, the geological force, this is not all completely detached from me. We might connect it in some sense, but you might still wonder, what does he have to add to this debate? It's a current debate, and in philosophy in philosophy and sociology and history of science, it's been taken up, and it's been taken up not in the sense of finding it to be in connection with idealism or modern thinking more generally, but as pushing us to find new forms of thought and to find new resources to deal with. And now, just in terms of why could it be interesting to look into Hegel in this regard, I just want to say the following. So, just in terms of a very schematic picture, you could say in the current philosophical appropriation of this notion of the Anthropocene, and people like Latour or Haraway or Briadotti, the general thinking is that we could say, well, the Anthropocene, or that we have entered this age, let's say what's connected to this new age, is largely being attributed to a certain kind of age that was not just understanding itself, but practicing a certain type of dualism of spirit and nature, or nature and culture. And in order to deal with the situation in which we're in which human activities have produced natural effects, so not intentional cultural effects, but natural effects that undermine our cultural possibilities, all of this shows that this kind of dividing the things, this dualism that we work in modernity between spirit and nature, necessity and freedom, nature and culture, this has to be superseded and overcome. This dualism is the actual problem. So the original sin is Descartes, and then from then on, everyone tries to mediate this, but doesn't really get out of it. And the right way to go is some form of monism, you could say, or some form of trying to undermine the very differentiations that have determined the modern self-understanding and also have been operative in the modern categories. So just in terms of the tendency, you could say there's at least a de-differentiating approach, and in many cases even an explicitly monist aspiration, right? So we have to overcome this dualism by virtue of a monism. And if that's the situation we're in, then at least it's interesting to look into Hegel, because it seems clear that he has sympathies with both in a certain sense. So he's not really into dualism, qua dualism. So if that's the end of it, it's not interesting. But he's very much into Entzweiung, into fundamental differences, tensions, and contradictions being constituted of the kinds of beings that we are and being constitutive of reality. And so in that sense, it's not a certain type of harmonious monism in everything, in which everything is the same. That's anathema to him. But on the other hand, he's not into dualism in the sense that we have a fractured world in which there's no mediation. So there's also some aspiration to monism in Hegel. And he thinks he has a third position. And you could say, with regard to these issues of the relation of spirit and nature, we might talk about the dialectical naturalism. So there is a sense in which he thinks or suggests that we cannot overcome the difference or distinction between spirit and nature. It would be foolish to assume we could abolish this, cancel out this division, and then suggest we can say anything meaningful at all anymore. So we can, if being no longer modern means that's not what he wants to do. But understanding difference in such a manner that it's no longer operating in the form of a dualism, that exactly is what we need to do. And so in that sense, this could offer us a third position, just very generally speaking. And therefore, I think it merits our attention and interest. Okay, so now let me come to the second point. So now I want to say, all right, okay, hopefully I've convinced you that there is a connection here. Let's follow the idea or the notion that Hegel in some sense fleshes out the kind of modern self-understanding that we have that underlies the kind of mode of life that we lead today and that has brought us into the situation in which we are. And I think that a very basic idea that seems quite persuasive in that direction or is interesting to look into is the following that you find in all kinds of writings by Hegel, but very beautifully expressed in this fragment on the philosophy of spirit. I'll read it out to you. And what he means here with it is spirit, where spirit comes from, that is from nature. Where it is going, that is towards freedom. What it is precisely this movement of liberating itself from nature. So spirit is the movement of liberating itself from nature. All right, I just take these couple of lines in bold here. This, on the face of it, seems to suggest that the direction here is very clear. So there's some kind of reverence to nature in the sense that Hegel says, well, spirit comes from nature. So yeah, there is some kind of a dependence there, or this is from where we come. But the direction also is very clear. The movement, where it's going, is towards freedom. And so freedom and nature are being opposed here, and nature is being cast in the role of what is to be superseded. To become free, to be self-determined, means to be no longer natural, to leave nature behind, to overcome nature, or to put it in check, if that's the best we can do, right? So to control it, to dominate it, to put it in its spot. Yeah, that's the first kind of read that most people will give this kind of line. Yeah, and I agree there are certain elements in Hegel that kind of work that way, and sometimes he talks that way. But if we look into this here, just these few lines here, even those, right? And my book is a lot about trying to understand this problem more properly here. Then it can't be quite right what I just said. So it's very interesting that Hegel here says, well, what spirit is precisely this movement of liberating itself from nature. So that seems to suggest once nature is out of the picture, there's no longer any spirit. Because spirit it's liberating itself from nature. So spirit also has to, and Hegel says this explicitly, posit nature as its presupposition. It has to establish and bring in nature time and again as the thing that it needs to overcome. And then more importantly, this is not in this quotation here, there's a way in which Hegel suggests that the actualization and realization of spirit only becomes complete where spirit takes on the form of a second nature. So where spirit becomes nature again, and where we reach a speculative standpoint from which finding nature as something given and positing it and freeing myself in it and for it are all the same. Yeah? So he has a much more complicated notion of what this liberation involves. And it definitely seems that when he says that spirit is this movement, then we cannot overcome nature, and nature needs to remain in the picture. Spirit even has to reproduce it in order to generate itself anew from it. Yeah. So nature can't fall out of the picture at all. So his kind of conception is more complicated and more naturalistic. So there's a certain sense in which the spirit is needs nature and produces nature, has to produce nature out of itself in order to bring about this kind of liberation. Now one could say, aha, okay, so the kind of liberation from nature does not mean leaving nature behind or simple domination of nature or controlling nature and putting nature in its spot, but it develops a more complicated notion. And the way in which I describe it in the book is to suggest that, well, the kind of liberation that Hegel describes actually works in the way, works like that the spirit has to produce a second nature. So it has to, and that could in more concrete terms mean we have to appropriate nature, make nature our own. That's a way in which we could say that we don't just take nature as a given, but appropriate it, relate to it, take it into possession, even without changing it. So we relate to first nature as something that stands in relation to spirit. We work to transform a nature. And that means we change the structure that nature has and use nature as the medium of the expression of spirit. And there's a third sense in which we could say, well, when nature has to produce, when spirit has to produce a second nature, there's also a way in which we try to put nature to work, to do spirit's work, to do the work of spirit's actualization. Yeah. And that is a picture in which nature has an essential role to play in the liberation and in the actualization of spirit. So it's not divided from nature. It's not getting rid of it, getting it out of the picture, thinking it could ignore it, but it's very much invested in nature and putting it to the right kind of use, right? In relating to nature in exactly the right way for spirit to be capable of being free and actualizing itself as free. So, and I would insist we need to see that. And not only if you see that, then also Hegel becomes more interesting. Because I think the Anthropocene, as I said before, is not just about leaving nature behind. I mean, what produced the Anthropocene is not a form of life that thought it can leave nature behind, or it can simply control or dominate nature. It is the effect of a culture that very much understood itself to be actualizing itself in nature, with the help of nature, by appropriating and transforming and changing nature. And feeling itself entitled to do that, right? By virtue of its freedom. Understanding itself to be a higher nature, you could say, that is entitled even has the task and the mission of changing the face of the world. Yeah. And so, therefore, I think this second understanding of liberation from nature is philosophically more interesting, more appealing, and also diagnostically more interesting, because I think it more aptly describes the form of life, the critique of which is our task. Yeah. All right. Just some further comments on this kind of liberation from nature. So Hegel thinks about it and reflects about it, what this would mean, and you could say there are two strands that are very prominent. So a theoretical approach to this question and a practical approach. And now, what would liberation from nature in this sense of appropriation, transformation, putting it to work mean? Well, in theoretical terms, it first means that we need a certain kind of relation to nature where we bring it under laws, where we make it intelligible to us. We don't give it the intelligibility of reason, you could say, but we do give it the intelligibility of the understanding, right? So we make nature understandable, calculable, and thereby make ourselves at home in nature and appropriate nature in a certain way. And I have a really nice quote. I think it's from the Philosophy of History. I'll read it out to you. The laws of nature were used to counter the immense superstition of the time and all notions of powerful foreign powers that could only be conquered through magic. The rule of the subject was set against the belief in authority, and the laws of nature were recognized as the only thing connecting the external with the external. Thus, all miracles were dissolved. For nature is now a system of known and recognized laws. Man is at home in it, and only that in which he is at home in is valid. He is free through the knowledge of nature. So here you see how Hegel suggests that, well, liberation from nature here does not mean, so free through the knowledge of nature. So the liberation here does not reside in forgetting about nature, being independent of it, not needing it anymore, not being subject to the necessities that it has, but not being subject to them as a foreign authority that I do not understand, not being subject to it as a source of magic or of things going on that I can't compute. If I have an understanding of nature as the realm of law, then through my knowledge of nature, I'm free, right? And there's a way in which you could say, maybe this even is a way of saying, well, this is even a liberation of nature. You have liberated nature into the intelligibility of the realm of law. So you have to brought it in there. Yeah. All right. So I just wanted to bring this element that already in our theoretical cognition, this plays a role. This kind of liberation of nature that's not just overcoming it, controlling it, but kind of accounting for it, giving it a certain type of intelligibility. And then in the practical approach, or in the practical, with regard to the practical approach, the liberation very much is being, I'm taking this from his philosophy of nature. There he makes this kind of distinction. In the practical approach, you could say very much the approach is to apply it as a means for the purposes of spirit. So there you have a form in which nature is being put to work, used as an instrument to bring about the end that spirit wants to bring about. But bringing it in this role obviously shows you that you can't do without it. So you can't leave it behind, and you can't, there's a way in which you could say the practical approach is a mode of controlling it. That's true. As a medium, it should have a kind of a subservient role. But it is not, so you have to take it seriously in the form that it has of its own in order to appropriate it in the right kind of way, to put it to the right kind of use. All right. Okay, so the image that I wanted to give you, all right, so liberation from nature, that's true, and spirit has the priority here, but Hegel is not so naive to think we can leave nature behind, or we can just at will control it, but no, we have to appropriate it, transform it, and put it to work. We have to use nature in its autonomous structure itself as the thing that might produce spirit, or might bring it about, or might keep it in existence, yeah? And so therefore it is a kind of an approach that thinks the liberation of nature, or the liberation from nature, the control of nature, requires an intense engagement with nature. Yeah? Therefore, it can explain why the form of life that we have, if that's our self-understanding, it's understandable how deeply involved we are with harvesting nature for the purposes of spirit. And now let me try to make this a little bit more concrete in terms of looking at possession, taking possession of nature, transforming nature, and putting nature to work. How is this present in Hegel's thinking? And how does this maybe direct our attention in the right kind of way to approach the epoch of the Anthropocene? So these are not only snapshots. I can really go into them, and I'm realizing that I'm already talking for a long time, so I have to be quick. But I think it still might be helpful to give you a more concrete sense of what am I talking about: taking possession of nature, making it work, transforming it. In Hegel's account in the philosophy of right, in the chapters on abstract right, Hegel begins from the very notion of property. And this is the notion that he introduces in order to suggest how we can understand the phenomenon of right in the most basic form. He is oriented by the question how, and that's the question that he asks in terms of a philosophy of right, well, how is it possible for the free will to give itself existence, right? So to manifest itself, to give itself existence. And the first kind of model that he brings up is the model of property, where you could say it works in this way. I have a certain given entity, a thing, and I put my will into the thing, I appropriate it, I declare it mine, and therefore find an external worldly manifestation of my will. By saying, this is my property, I have something in the world that manifests my will, that makes my will a sensible, existing, corporeal, natural phenomenon, if you will, and gives it this kind of flesh in the world. For this constellation to work on Hegel's account, we first start from the basic understanding that there are two fundamentally different things in the world, or entities, you could say, things and persons. A thing is, as he defines it there, something unfree, non-personal and rightless, ein unfreies, unpersönliches, rechtloses. And the person is the exact opposite. It's the free, the personal, the one that has a right. And by virtue of this contrast, he comes to the position that he says, well, the person has the right of putting its will into anything. That is, it has the absolute right of appropriation which human beings have over all things. And then in his notes, he also gives you the kind of biblical background and kind of ideational background that kind of informs this picture. The human being is master over everything in nature. Yeah. And for Hegel, this serves a very basic function in terms of getting the notion of right off the ground. So it's very, very elemental, fundamental, elementary for our self-understanding. And you see here stark asymmetry between thing and person. And you see, well, the person had the absolute right of appropriation, and the thing only serves in the function of the thing being appropriate. It's only there to be appropriated. It has no role of its own. It has no right of its own. It's not free. It has no person. And so in the sphere of right, you could say it has no active position. It's just the object of the doings of the subject and its will. Yeah. This also could give you then very clearly the idea that, if that's our conception, that this is the fundamental starting position from which we come, then we are fundamentally related to nature, but the kind of relation we have to it is completely one-sided and asymmetrical. And you could say the kind of notion of freedom that comes out in these passages, or that seems to be suggested by these passages, is the following: freedom is the rule of the free over the unfree. Freedom is the rule of the free over the unfree. Meaning, in the world you need, or in the universe, or in the, I don't know, you need unfree things that can be owned by free beings. Free beings need unfree things in order to realize themselves through them. All right. So this idea of taking possession, I think, is very, very clear and very stark. And Hegel says it more clearly than many other people, you could say, a notion that does inform our conception of right. And so in the current rights of nature movements and in these discussions, this is exactly the distinction that's being attacked. And now the question is, how is it attacked? So often it's attacked in the following sense: nature should be regarded a person too, in order to be in the position of a rights holder and not just the object of other rights holders. That's one way to undermine it. Another way to undermine it would be to do away with this contrast in some sense or form. But it's very hard to say what exactly that would look like. And the other thing is much more easily done, you could say, right? It's also complicated because nature or natural entities, rivers, ecosystems need to be brought into the right by virtue of a representative structure, but you just shift it into the role of the person, and then the thing operates like it did before. But you can question then whether the actual machine is not still the same. All right, but I think it's very recognizable that Hegel thinks, okay, our relation to nature, we need to appropriate it, take possession of it. And in his conception of property, he very much fleshes this out. Second point, transforming nature, labor. I said I can talk about habit as well. That's very much centered on my own nature, right? In habit, I make my own body, I appropriate my own body, I transform my own body. I give myself a body that's the effect, the result of the doings, of the repeated exercises, of the repeated movements I have made and I have done. I change the character of my body and my relation to the world by virtue of that. And that's interesting, but it's very much focused on the subjective nature of the subject. And I think in terms of the Anthropocene, we are very much interested in the relation of the human nature to the non-human nature. So the way in which we need non-human nature as a medium of the realization of spirit, but then also as something that now bites us back in a certain way. And so, therefore, labor, I think, here is the more interesting case. And you all know that this notion of labor is most prominently developed in the context of the phenomenology in the master-servant chapter. And there is quite interesting how it's introduced. So my suggestion up until now was to say, well, Hegel is not advocating for the domination of nature, just leaving nature behind. And this is very clear in the master-servant dialectic. So in the master-servant dialectic, the master seems to win the game of the game or the battle of recognition, you could say. He's the one being recognized, and he really waged his life. His life was at stake. He was putting it at stake and had the courage to do that, and therefore he won the game. And the servant reattached himself to his life and shrinked away from the freedom and the recognition, and has no recognition. And now it's just in the position of having to asymmetrically recognize the master. And the master has thereby also removed from nature. He has kind of positioned the servant between himself and nature. The servant kind of prepares nature in such a form that then the master can just purely genießen, can purely enjoy, purely consume nature, and therefore has abolished nature as a self-standing entity, right? And so this is the kind of constellation that it comes from. But then, interestingly, what Hegel wants to say is that, well, the master is a dead end. It's not getting us anywhere. This kind of idea of that we could rule nature in this manner, it does not work at all. The master has not gotten the recognition that he needs because he doesn't recognize the person that is supposed to recognize him. Yeah, therefore it's void. So he hasn't really won the battle of recognition. And what the master also has taken away from himself is his interaction with the world. So there is no way in which he really develops any kind of capacities and also manifests himself in the world. The actual being that does this, although obliquely, although not really manifestly yet, is the servant by virtue of labor. There are all kinds of other things that are important about the servant, but let's now just focus on labor. So Hegel suggests that what the servant is doing, he's actually engaging with the non-human natural nature, engaging with this matter and working upon it, thereby also understanding himself or herself as a natural being and transforming the way in which nature is, such that nature becomes reflective of the being of the servant. And so what the servant thereby produces is, in a certain sense, a way for treating nature as the medium of its own self-expression. It's not working like that immediately because the servant doesn't try to express himself. Actually, he's expressing the wishes and the wills of his master, but there is a way in which it works upon nature and also so what's the English term? Gehemmte Begierde. So it's not consuming directly. It's not just satisfying his desire immediately, but it's just it's a halted, kind of paused form of Begierde, and that becomes productive. And so this kind of spiritual activity of labor transforms the shape of the world and gives another form to the world, a form that is reflective of spirit, such that we can recognize ourselves in our products, but also create a world and not just live. We do not live on the earth anymore, just on the earth. We do not just have an earth, but we live in a world. So we constitute a world that's constituted of all kinds of objects our labor has gone into and that operate with each other, that are coordinated to one another, are interlinking in such a manner that they are the infrastructure for the production and the reproduction of spirit. So the manifestation and expression of it, but also the machinery out of which we can recreate spirit. So we give a different shape to nature. By virtue of work, we transform the face of the earth in such a manner that it now reproduces spirit. Yeah. So transforming nature labor. In this emphasis on labor, you can very much see this kind of the way in which Hegel tries to show us the appeal of not leaving nature behind or just shouting orders at it like the master does vis-a-vis the servant, but working upon it and working with it, right? But thereby really completely giving it a different form. And now the third element, making nature productive. Well, the first two stages, you could say, well, I need to take hold of nature to work with it anyhow, right? So I need to first say, this is mine, or grab it at least, bring it into my possession to work upon it, to transform it. But once I've transformed it, well, then you could say, well, then I have given a spiritual shape to the world, and then I have completed my mission, right? So then nature has resumed a different, I have treated nature as the matter, the Stoff, given it a different form, and thereby created a different entity, a spiritual object, an object that is part of a world, and thereby the thing is done and it's over. So and we are complete. If that were the case, however, then we would need to do the same thing again and again, right? Every new being would come onto the scene and would be in an earth and has to produce a world from it, right? And maybe there's a sense in which this is true, but Hegel is interested in the way in which you could say that we do not just and are not content with just giving a different form to nature, but then also make nature productive to bring about spirit. And that's mainly in the form of second nature, you could say. So the transformed nature is still a form of nature. Yeah. So if I have labored on an object and have produced a tool, I still have a physical object that works upon other things physically. It is informed by a spiritual form and a spiritual purpose, but it's still a part of nature and still operates as a part of nature. And so for it not to be just a singular expression of spirit, so that I have just imprinted my seal onto nature, but for it now to do the work of spirit, that would be much better, right? It would be much more interesting, because then I have really transformed nature, because I have turned nature into a mechanism productive of spirit. And I think that Hegel is very interested in this notion, and that's very much connected to the notion of a second nature. And you could say, we could just point into two directions. And I really need to close soon, so let me just say this, and then tell you a little bit about how he is an internal critic of all these things as well. So making nature productive in a subjective and an objective manner. So if you look at the way in which Hegel describes civil society, yeah? Civil society is very much described as a geistiges Tierreich, you could say. So you have spiritual beings out of the family. They are risen in a family. They have already lived an ethical life in the organic ethical life of their families. But then they are thrown out, and it's a socially produced state, but it's a socially produced state of asocial behavior. The ethical beings are now being pushed into civil society, treated as individuals that are only to pursue their own interests, and they are behaving like animals, you could say. Or like the animals of the survival of the fittest are being portrayed, right? And are supposed to work just in the service of their own purposes or own ends or own interests or own desires. But by virtue of the fact that they can only reach it through cooperation, they're being forced to interlink and work with each other, and are being turned into chains within a link, as Hegel puts it. So he describes civil society as a certain kind of mechanism. Yeah? And then he wants to say, well, this mechanism has no ethical idea. In civil society, I don't tell you what to want, what your interests are, what you should do. I just leave it to you. And you should pursue them as you see fit, as long as you kind of coordinate yourself with the others. So I don't really interfere. I don't give you a substantive ethical idea of what you are. I let you operate kind of like an animal. But in doing so, in making you work with the others, what is happening is something that Hegel calls Bildung. So a certain kind of ethical life is produced behind our backs. So we make nature, our desires, our animal desires, so to speak, produce spirit, right? That's how civil society works. And he's also interested in the objective side of physical side. If you look into his ruminations about the machine in the Jena writings, and then in certain notes also in the later times, where you can see. So you would think in terms of teleology that the most important thing or the most powerful thing that happens in purposive context, in teleological context, is the end, right? The end is orienting the whole process, and that's the most important thing. But already in describing teleology, Hegel realizes, well, you know what? Actually, the tool is more interesting, because the tool that I produce is not exhausted by the completion of the purpose. If I have produced something that operates as a tool, it has not served its function and just drops down to being a natural thing again, but the tool can be used for various purposes. So it has a greater universality or power. Yeah. And the machine it's just one step further down the line from the tool, where this kind of dynamic then becomes self-active. So where it's not just that I produced a tool that has this universality, but where there is something that's being productive of tools, you could say, yeah, as an autonomous process. And so in a certain sense, the machine seems to be of a similar sort. You have a certain kind of mechanism, a natural kind of configuration that does the work of spirit. So we delegate the work of spirit to a mechanism in the form of civil society, or to a machine in a certain kind of productive process. Yeah? And Hegel very much on the first level sees the rationality of that and the power of this idea. So I hopefully have persuaded you that Hegel is an arc-modernist, right? And it has a very subtle and interesting conception of what liberation from nature does. One that means that we have to heavily engage with nature, and has a very, very complex, subtle kind of picture of it, but also one that very much explains the kind of relation our form of life has to nature, one that is possessive, taking appropriate in nature, one that thinks of itself to be entitled to give a new form to nature, regardless of the form that it has, regardless of the things that it might want of its own accord, or the form that it needs to sustain by its own accord. So it's just serving as this material for that, it seems. And then even we want to make it do our work, right? So it's not enough for us that we say that I want to put my seal on it and say, you see, this is mine, or you can read my spiritual existence of it, but I even want to have it do my work, right? And so make it part of my spiritual economy. And so if that's my attitude to nature, it's very easy to see how we could lose track of the ways in which life is the material and genetic condition of our human freedom, our spiritual freedom. Now, what I wanted to do in the third part is first revisit this notion of a liberation from nature, because I have left out two things that Hegel says as well and makes clear. When he talks about the liberation from nature, he very clearly brings out that liberation of spirit from nature actually requires two further things. Not just liberation from nature, it also requires the liberation of spirit in nature and as nature. So there's a way in which spirit needs to be able to take on the form of nature itself again. And so there nature gains a different kind of dignity and also becomes evident as something that cannot serve just as the material, just as the dispensable object. So like in the form of property, we appropriate it and throw it away and use it up. Yeah. So it has a different meaning there. And then most interestingly, he also says, well, that this liberation of spirit from nature requires the liberation of nature itself. And you could say even and that's maybe debatable, liberation of nature from spirit. And this is the most interesting idea to me to develop further. And I don't think that it's really fully fleshed out in Hegel, but it's there. And one part of the work where it is in the aesthetics. Have to take me at my word there. But in terms of the three things that I've given you, property, labor, and making nature productive, I can make the point more easily and I make it more, can make the more direct point that all of the notions that I have introduced to you, yeah, are introduced in Hegel in a powerful way and in a way in which Hegel wants to show us their appeal. But ultimately, he also wants to show us that all of these are insufficient or even contradictory, need to be superseded in a deep manner. Yeah? Taking possession of nature is the beginning of abstract law, and it then very quickly becomes clear that there's a certain contradiction involved in the very idea. If I want something to be an expression of my will and say, well, actually what expresses my will is this thing, which is rightless, has no will, and is no person, this is a strange idea. How could something that has nothing, that has no will of its own, that has no connection to any will, that is just the opposite of any will, be an expression of my will? Yeah, it seems, you could also say, well, but it needs to be that way, because otherwise, if it has a will of its own, how could it express my will? But Hegel shows us the absurdity of the idea of possession, and the way in which he thinks about the fact that we actually do not just need to take possession, we also need to let go and exchange things with people, has to do with the fact not just that he disregards the things as void and vacuous, but that he sees this kind of taking possession does not work at all. It's self-contradictory. And the actual kind of realm of right is formed on the basis of a relation between will and will, where the thing serves as a mediator between us. But when it's a mediator between us, it's no longer rightless. It's no longer a thing bereft of any kind of meaning. It is something that mediates between the two of us. Yeah. So this is a notion that Hegel thinks very quickly shows we need to overcome. That this is unsustainable. I think you can say something similar about labor. You can see how there are certain kind of contradictions in the social structure of labor, and also a certain kind of contradiction in terms of the relation of subject and object that is part of the labor relation. The second point, I'm pointing you there to a very interesting passage in the Aesthetics, where Hegel suggests that we do not need just the theoretical relation to the world that we have in terms of explaining the world, or the practical relation that we have to it in labor, where we just make use of it in a certain sense to realize our purposes. There is another way to relate, or for the subject and the object to relate, in which both of them become more free than they are in the labor relation. Yeah. So this is being shown as a limited actualization of freedom that needs to be superseded by something else. And with regard to civil society, at least the symptoms are very known to you all. So it's very clear that the kind of production of ethical life that happens behind our backs creates, on Hegel's own account, problems that civil society on its own cannot solve. And therefore, we need the corporations, which are which are a Wurzel, kind of a basis, a fundament for ethicality within civil society, and lead us then further to the state. And we have a very critical discussion of the machine. So the power of the idea is being explained, but then Hegel very quickly shows us how the machine, how there's a certain kind of ironic structure where the machine then turns us into cogs in the machine. And we know we do not have the effect that we intended, where we delegated the world of spirit to a machine and wanted to make nature productive in reproducing spirit. So you can see in Hegel very clearly that he wants to show the appeal of these ideas, and also show how they are maybe superseding more basic ideas that are even less interesting and less productive. But he's very, very attuned to the irresolvable tensions that are part of these ideas, that are implicit in these ideas. And I think that we can use Hegel as a resource to develop these internal contradictions. And that is the place where we are, that we feel the appeal of these ideas still, and therefore have to weigh our work up to the inside into their contradictoriness and the need for us to supersede them. Thank you very much.